Okay. So once again, welcome all who are here in person, and also there are those who are on the live stream. No, this is not for us, it's for the live stream. So people who are now watching on live stream can hear. And so I just want to say, first of all, a few words about Helen Radin, for whom this yearly lecture is named, who was a wonderful member of our community, very devoted to the Khebra Kadisha, and also started her journey in this community as my assistant and Marcelo's assistant. And she was a wonderful person to have on the staff and as to support our work. She knew everything about us, about our lives, about our work, so much so that there were many times when I had to say, Helen, I have a mother. Because she was so warm and embracing, and also, you know, then she, I think, fell in love with the community. She became a part of the community. She was active. She was very, very also community oriented, and her home was open for many, many membership and new members receptions and all sorts of. She was very generous in that way, and she left us at the end of 2007. But she left a big mark. She was with us for about 12 years in this community, and she left a big mark, and she left a big mark in the Khebra Kadisha. And another person who left us earlier this year is the beloved Bob Grunspect. I know that a few words were said about him before. I just want to add, also particularly for the people who are on YouTube, that he was such a compassionate, caring, loving person with enormous humility. And he never called attention to himself. He did really hard work in this Khebra Kadisha, and took it really with tremendous commitment, and he just quiet, you know, peseta, in just almost like in hiding. And he was a presence in our community, very quiet, but very constant presence in our community. He always had generous and positive words to say about, you know, I mean, he would come to Felicia and to me, you know, and to Ari and Becca, and always had such kind words to say, and such gratitude. He lived with a lot of gratitude. Even in his struggle with his illness, he was incredibly strong and always hopeful and always grateful. Even when he was suffering, he always found some words of gratitude for being alive, and for the blessings in his life, and for Ruti, who accompanied him. They were such a wonderful, beautiful couple, united by very deep love, and she took care of him magnificently. So he will also be remembered with great love and gratitude by all of us. So now I would like to introduce our speaker, Sally Berkovic, who was born in Australia and is the daughter of Slovakian Holocaust survivors. Sally grew up in Melbourne and lived in Jerusalem, and she also lived here in New York before an epistolary romance brought her to London. Since 2009, she has been the CEO of the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, supporting Jewish heritage and culture. Her first book, Under My Hat, was published in 1997 and was shortlisted for the Jewish Quarterly Prize. It is a social commentary memoir focused on the challenges of raising daughters while straddling the tensions between an orthodox religious life and the competing forces of secularism. Updated and reissued in 2019, the book explores the impact of more than 20 years of evolutionary change, including women's scholarship, Orthodox women clergy, enhanced ritual participation, and women's political and communal leadership. But tonight she's here to speak about, this is another book called Death Duties, Loss, Mourning, and the Chevra Kadisha. And when our mutual friend Seth Aronson called to inquire if we would be interested in a presentation by Sally, originally the date that she was planning to be here was sometime in March originally, and I said, you know, maybe this would be appropriate. You know, Zayin Adar for us is a very important date in our community, and she said by all means, and here she's on Zayin Adar. So finally, before Sally gets up, and thank you so much for coming, I just want to say, I know that we don't thank the Chevra Kadisha. You know, you're not supposed to say thank you for this incredible mitzvah that you do. Nonetheless, I will break the rules, and on behalf of the entire community and of my colleagues, I want to say that, as I always say, and we all say it and think this is the most special part of our community, and the holiest part of our community, the holiest committee group of people in our community is this. All the other things are things that are easier to do. This takes really special people with a special commitment and with a much deeper understanding of what the mitzvot are about. What the mitzvot are about, if you don't understand this, you don't understand it fully. And I think all of you do this work with such devotion and such love for God and for members of our community to whom you do this incredible kindness. And so thank you and Yashar Koach for everything you do, and continue to do it and recruit other people. We need to continue to bring new people into this holy circle. So thank you so much.
I will lie on a cold metal table. A sheet will cover my still naked body. It is a body that no one other than my husband has ever seen. It will be tranquil in the room. 4 holy women of the Chevra Kadisha will wash their hands, dry them with paper towels, and pat their splayed palms with talcum powder. This helps to slide on the 2 sets of latex gloves that they will wear. In a quiet murmur, each one will say the designated blessings for the task ahead. No words other than brief instructions will be said, and so will begin the preparations for my burial. A simple pine coffin sits on a raised trolley in the room. It will be filled with some sawdust. Some earth from the land of Israel will be sprinkled on top of the sawdust. And a couple of small padded cotton bags will be placed in the coffin as a pillow for my weary head that will sleep for a very long time. As I lie flat, one woman will stand on my right side, another on my left, and the third behind my head, gently supporting it lest it rolls. The 4th woman will ensure things are done correctly and pass relevant instruments to the others at the right time. 3 women will delicately lift the sheet, stand behind it, and the 4th will pull at a strategically placed shower head and spray me with water from my head to my toes as I lie on my back. The woman on the left will heave my body over to the right side, and one of the other women will take the shower head and spray me with water as I lie side on. The water will continue to drizzle to the tips of my toes. This process will be repeated as they heave my body on the left side. There is a vat of rainwater perched on a specially designed contraption above the metal table. Once I have been physically cleaned with tap water, I will be ritually cleaned with the rainwater, the same sort of water that filled the mikveh, the ritual bath, that I used every month during my marriage, except for when I was pregnant and now after menopause. The woman standing at my head will release a lever that will tip the water onto my head. Holding onto the handle of the lever, she will walk slowly the length of my body, ensuring that the rainwater spills out of the vat and covers all of me. A short prayer will be said, closing with the words, Tahara, 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 pure, pure, pure. On a significant birthday, quite a while ago now, I decided I wanted to give myself a gift. And that gift, because I like coloured scarves, was not going to be another scarf, but it was going to be to join the Chevra Kadisha in London. And I wanted to do it for many reasons, some of which I'll talk about this evening. But one of them was that my mother had died when I was quite young and she was quite young. And when I got to the age where she had died, I thought, it suddenly occurred to me, what happened to her? And what is this all about, the Chevra Kadisha? And so I did some of my own investigation. I actually found the person who did the Chevra, who did the Tahara, because it sort of became a thing. I wanted to understand that more. But I also I wanted to join the Chevra in London, and I wanted to learn a bit more about the history, the traditions. I understand many of you are part of the Chevra here, maybe all of you, which is unlike where I've often spoken before, where it's completely new for people. So I'll be very interested in what you do in your community and how it may differ from what we do. But let me introduce you to the people of Prague. In the late 1700s and 1800s, a series of about 15 to 16 paintings were made representing the Chevra Kadisha of Prague. And this is the one I picked. There are many of them, but I picked this one because it's specifically for Zayin Adar. It was a painting of what happened. They also celebrated, commemorated Zayin Adar, and I thought this would be a wonderful way to start our evening, sharing this painting with you. In London, we certainly have a Zayin Adar, which the men meet on Zayin Adar. The women do it on after Tzom Gedalia, just after Rosh Hashanah. And this, maybe some of you know some of these people. This is from the State Archives of the Ohev Shalom in Orlando. They also were having a dinner in the Chevra was founded in 1918, and they were having a dinner in 1942. I saw you were gathering before, having a bite to eat. Perhaps that's your Zayin Adar dinner. You should take some photos and make that a part of your collective archive as well. So there are many ways to I use the word celebrate. Perhaps, it's perhaps not quite the right word, but I think it's an important way. We are celebrating life in the way that we deal and help people in death. Now, Pinkasim, oh gosh. Sorry, I have to be careful what I use. I didn't realize it goes so, right, I have to be careful. Pinkasim are records of sort of birth, deaths, marriages in a community, and particularly the Pinkas for the Chevra Kadisha list all the people that died. There are thousands of them from different communities across Eastern Europe. They may well be in other countries as well. I'm more familiar with Eastern European situation. Over the years, many of them have been digitized. There are large online collections. This one is from Juhel in Hungary, and you'll see here that after the Holocaust, the names of the people who died in the Holocaust were added to that Pinkas, and it's very moving. There are all sorts of images. I just wanted to, I really going to give you a sort of sweeping taste of many different items connected to Chevra Kadisha, and I just thought the Pinkas was really interesting. And when we think about nowadays what's recorded, probably many things are digitized. Your shul records are all digitized. So what will remain of our records over time? We'll get to that towards the end about thinking about digitally what's the impact on the Chevra Kadisha. I just want to make sure right, it's this way, okay. After the Shoah, there were body remains, what did the community do? What did the Israeli government do with them? How were they remembered? And this is an extraordinary moving photo, I think, of a vehicle of the Chevra Kadisha. It left Lod Airport to take the remains of the Holocaust survivors, of victims, to be buried in Jerusalem in 1949. It's a very powerful picture. I don't know, I've only come across this fairly recently and I want to do some more research on it. I don't know if there was only ever one truck, more trucks, I don't know, and if any of you have information, be very interested to hear that. So this notion of even in, wanting to ensure that those people would have some sort of ceremony and to be remembered meaningfully. On that note, let me tell you a little bit about my family, because the Holocaust looms large. It looms large for the Jewish people, but I grew up in a community where I was probably 20 before I met somebody, other than non-Jewish people I knew. I was probably 20 before I met a Jewish person whose parents were not Holocaust survivors. It was very much a community of Holocaust survivors. My parents both came from Slovakia, although they came separately to Australia. And on Sunday afternoons, we would get together with whoever else was from their villages, and they became our family. And it's very typical of Melbourne and Sydney Jewry, and possibly some of you are in that situation as well. So the photo over there is of my mother when she was about 10, 11 in Slovakia. And this photo, this man is named Naftali First. He's my mother's cousin. His mother and my mother's mother were sisters. He's now 91, 92. He does a lot of Holocaust education going across Germany and Slovakia, talking to children's groups, school groups. And this woman is a woman named Amelia. Now, this photo, a few years ago, Naftali's also written a little bit about his personal story. He's got a website. Just park that bit of information for the moment. He gets an email with a letter saying, "My name is Pietra. I found this photo in my grandmother's attic, and your address was on it. I Googled, and I found you. Do you know who this woman is?" And the photo was my mother. So Naftali writes to me, goes, "Are you sitting down? I've got some news for you." And I knew this photo. It's not like it was made up. I had a copy of this photo. It transpires that the grandson who showed to his grandmother, who is this woman? They'd say, Evichka, Evichka. It's a diminutive of my mother's name, Eva, and she didn't want to talk about it. So Naftali, we then went to Bratislava. I met Naftali there, and we went, and we found, they showed us where they had hidden my mother underground in a basement, and they had this woman, it was her mother that, her mother's family that hid my mother, and she remembers taking down bits of food underground to my mother and my grandmother. My mother wasn't not alive, so she doesn't, she never got to sort of thank these people. Then it took us a little while, and we were able to have Amelia and her family recognised as righteous Gentiles in Yad Vashem. And I wanted to give you that bit of context because when I started doing the Chevra, it occurred to me that what happened during the Holocaust, who did nobody did the Chevra Kadisha of all the victims, of the people who were killed. And it was sort of something that it just hadn't registered, and it's almost embarrassing to admit now that as an adult, as I started doing the Chevra, I started thinking about this. And as I wrote a little bit here, it was only as an adult it dawned on me that when my grandparents and all the millions of others who died in the various camps, there was no Chevra Kadisha to tend to their deaths. There's no cemetery or polished tombstone to visit. Now, many of you may have been to Auschwitz or the death camps and gone on these sort of death tourism sites, as I call them, or they're called. And I'm ambivalent about those visits, but what I realised when I was there was, yes, the Nazis took away life, but they also took away the opportunity to grieve in the way that in our traditional, the way that we grieve. We couldn't do those things. My father used to keep Shavuot as his the yahrzeit for his family because that's when they were deported. He doesn't know exactly when his relatives died, but they were all deported on Shavuot, so that became his yahrzeit date. And through my work, I travel quite a bit in Europe, throughout Europe, but particularly Eastern Europe. And when I was in Ukraine, this way before the war, for some meetings, I found out or realised that I can just take a train ride and you get to the playgrounds in Babi Yar, and that's where the ravines were. So it's very present there in Eastern Europe, but it's also present as a Jew when you visit these places and you realise, yes, there was tremendous death, but actually there was also tremendous ritual taken away from people. So I wanted, it's all these things that impacted on not on the way I do the Chevra Kadisha, but it's sort of those of you who are involved, you're thinking all sorts of things as you're tending to a body. And these are some of the things that occur to me. So I'm speaking to a group of people who know about tachrichim, you know what the shrouds look like, and I'm sure many of you know their origins, but I wanted just to share this source with you. You can sort of browse it as I'm just speaking. The basic idea is that in Mishnaic times, some people were dressed beautifully to be buried. They'd put on the finest clothes, and then some families who were poorer couldn't afford to dress their deceased relatives in nice clothes, and they would leave them by the roadside. And that's what's talked about here. That was very undignified. And Rabban Gamliel said, this is unacceptable, we can't have this, and decreed that everybody should be buried in the same very simple cloths. And we'll talk about the tachrichim in a moment. But the origin really is, we come into this world in one way, we go out in the same way, we should all be equal, and you shouldn't be able to buy a nicer way of looking for your funeral. So this is sort of the source for our tachrichim. And the women and the men, since the men were sewing as well, this is from that series of paintings that I mentioned at the beginning of men and women making the shrouds. I just think it's I don't know if men actually did it or if it was staged, I have to say, because although perhaps it was very progressive that the men were sewing at that time as well. So the tachrichim, I'm going to assume most of you know what they are if you've been on the Chevra. But there's the bonnet, I won't go into detail, the bonnet, the shirt, the pants, and a sort of big coat, a kittel for the men and a sort of coat-like garment for the women as well, and men get buried in a talit, and that they cut the talit. Now, I'll be very interested if it's different in your community, I'll ask you in a moment, but what I really wanted to share with you was the women of Oslo. Now, you probably buy them in bulk. Certainly in London we buy them in bulk. But in Oslo and in many small communities, it's a thing to sew the tachrichim. It becomes part of their community. I was going to say folk not folk tradition, that's not fair. That's the wrong word. But their identity is to embolden and empower themselves by taking ownership of their own tachrichim. And perhaps I can't... of having to speak into the microphone, but if someone can see it, she says here, before the war, the sewing took place in secrecy. As she explains, when she was a girl, there were times when her grandmother would shoo her out and her siblings to play outside. And that's how they knew that the women were sewing. And the idea was that they were sewing their own tachrichim. And the last sentence, we prepare tachrichim for our aunts, friends, mothers, and sometimes we prepare them for ourselves. And I just thought that was a very moving idea of preparing your own tachrichim. Those of you who perhaps were in Israel last year, May, June time, there was a wonderful exhibition at the Israel Museum of tachrichim. It was quite a small exhibition. Did anyone happen to see it? I'm not sure if it's still on, but they had from Sephardi, Ashkenazi, all sorts of communities, and this is from Frankfurt, Germany. I don't know why there are these decorative black ribbons, because we certainly don't have that now. But I thought it was interesting. I wanted to share that with you. And this is another set. You'll see the little booties at the bottom there. The ones that we have are more like a jumpsuit where it's all one piece, but not here. Oh. You have boot. Oh, that's interesting, right? With a little bow that you do a half bow on. Okay, we have the one piece. We tie a bow around the ankle, but it's all in one. So this is just an image from the exhibition where there's a whole lot of different tachrichim on display. And you'll see here, flying flat, are a couple of decorative headpieces from Germany again. And I need to do a bit more research. I don't know why they are decorative, given what we've said about everything being very simple. But I just think they're wonderful images. In the Yemenite community and some of the other Sephardi communities, men are married in the kittel that they will then be buried in. And I believe some women, I'm not saying they get buried in their bridal outfits, but there's an element of their bridal outfit which is then used in their when they're buried. So I found that was on display. It was really extremely interesting. This is just a couple more images. Okay, so what happens at the oh, sorry, I have to go back. What's happened to my? What I wanted to share with you is what happens during the Tahara, but we'll do this fairly quickly because you all know it, but I wanted to show you these images. And I've managed to find pictures that were from training programs on YouTube, which is just really interesting that there's actually so much out there. And if you just Google Tahara, Tahrichim, anything, it'll all come up. And they're very, very useful. So I've put together a few images. But also there's an artist named Karen Benioff who's done some beautiful paintings about Tahara, and I've interspersed them with these photos because I just think they add an extra cadence. And I love this picture of the 4 women about to do their Tahara from the 1940s, some chapter of maybe Hadassah, I can't remember where, and I should try and find out. They're very serious, the task ahead. And I said in my little presentation at the beginning, we use like a little contraption, a vat full of water that is then spilt on the person. Here they use buckets, and many communities just have buckets depending on, I guess, the equipment available. And you'll tell me shortly about what you do. And I presume the sheets on the table are the tefillot that they're about to say. Okay. So the woman comes into the room from the hospital or from the nursing home, wherever, or from her own home, and put in whatever clothes she comes in, and is put onto a metal table. We use a metal table. Other people have wooden slats that they use. There are various there's no right or wrong. It's just different customs in different places. This is one of the paintings that I mentioned. At all times, when the body doesn't need to be uncovered, it's covered. It's very, I'm sort of preaching to the converted here, it's a very dignified, very respectful environment in the room. And I have to say, I feel that's, for me, that's my spiritual moments in the Tahara room. It's not so much in shul or in other sorts of places, but there's something very dignified about it that adds a level of spirituality for me. So I think this painting is beautiful. The body is washed. They've used a dummy as part of the training program to show how they wash the body and the feet. This is all before the actual tahara of the actual water, the purified water. This is the sort of cleaning of the body. And then they use buckets, and they've blotted out the woman's ostensibly naked body. You can see a wooden slat hanging over the edge, I guess, to raise her so that her back can be washed as well. And this is a painting from the series of paintings about Tahara that I think is very, very moving. And they dress her in the tachrichim, and here they put the earth. Do you use soil on the person's eyes? Yeah. Some people use pottery shards. Do you also use both? Oh, how interesting. What's the origin of the pottery shards? I don't actually know. Sorry? You hate them, okay. There are so many customs that they just evolved, and there are a few collections of customs, but there's very little, from what I understand, very little halachic demands. It's a lot of customs have evolved. And this painting of the woman being sort of finally wrapped up and the bows being done. And very gently, I think this is a wonderful photo, very gently being placed in the casket, and the sheet, which will be the final sheet wrapped over her. Now, I mentioned that, as you know, the bit of soil of Israel is put on the person's eyes. And that's, you know, when I travel to Israel, there's a WhatsApp group from our Chevra. If anyone's going to Israel, don't forget to bring back soil for the Chevra. And I'm always worried, you know, at the security at El Al, you know, are you taking anything? Are you bringing anything? And you say, well, I've got, you know, land of Israel filled for the Chevra Kadisha work. But what used to happen, or one option people had, was that they would send earth from Israel to communities abroad. And this is a wonderful, I think, a wonderful item of earth from Har Zaytim, from Mount of Olives. And it was, I mentioned little pillows that are put in our coffins. Well, this would have been the pillow that would have been put in the coffin of somebody. I don't know where it was sent, but I just like the idea of pillows of earth being sent to communities across the world. I don't have this tzedakah box, but I think it's fantastic. I have a photo of it. This is from Mantua, Italy, 1790. So that's the front of the box you can see over on the side. And you have a choice of where you want to put your money. You can either donate it to poor people, or you can donate it to the Nasat Kala for the brides, or you can give it to the Chevra Kadisha. So the top picture, I've got all the three of them closed, and then I sort of played around with it. I met somebody who has the object, and I took photos, and sort of opened that up and took another photo, you know, as if you're about to drop a coin into the Chevra Kadisha box. And I just think it's you know, it's an old item. The work of the Chevra is so central to a community and given such a degree of honour and a conscious, you know, you have to raise money for the Chevra. You have to ensure that people who can't afford to be buried are buried, all sorts of things that need to happen to make a Chevra work. This is a comb given to a burial society in Galicia. You know, when we do the Chevra, you use a plastic comb from the chemist, you comb somebody's hair, and as you know, if any hair comes off on the comb, it gets buried into the coffin as well. Now, I don't know if this comb was actually used. It doesn't look particularly practical, but I thought it was it looks very heavy as well, but I thought it was a beautiful item. It was donated by Gifted Fager Siegel in memory of her husband and her son, and gifted to a Chevra Kadisha. Now, I don't know if things have been gifted to your Chevra Kadisha, and I don't know nowadays what would be an appropriate gift, but it's an interesting thought. There are records of, I mentioned the Pinchasim earlier on, records of people who die in a community, and these are collected in books, there are books about a Chevra, and there are loads of them, and I just picked one image from the Chevra Kadisha of Rechnitz that's being held by the Austrian Jewish Museum. And you can see it's very evocative pictures in the front of different stages and different death scenes and different funeral scenes as well. So there's a lot of visual art, visual culture around Chevra Kadisha. And this is a medal from 1876 held in the museum in Switzerland from Gallingen. I don't know what do you use here to commemorate the work of your Chevra? Do people get is there a little badge? Is there something? Sorry? Tonight. No, but I'm wondering if there's a physical item. And I don't know I don't know what a contemporary Chevra does, to be honest. I've asked this question before, and there aren't things. In Ansbach, they had a becher, and people who were couldn't have been everybody in the Chevra, but perhaps they were the presidents of the Chevra or wealthy people, I just don't know, whose names were engraved on the becha. And I thought this was quite just an interesting thing. And it would be used at the dinner. Maybe they said kiddush, or maybe they just drank a l'chaim, I don't know what they did. And this was the special becha that was used. And some of the people's names are in the Ansbach cemetery till now, Ansbach. This is, I think, my favourite item. Where do you think this might be from? They do look like nuns, but they're not. It's the Sofia Bulgarian Women's Chevra Kadisha from 1933. And I think it's just this fantastic photo, a picture. And they're all dressed as nuns. It's a bit odd. Maybe they were nurses rather than nuns, but it does look very nun-y, nunnery, like from a nunnery. But I think it's just a very, there were a lot of women. I guess the community was very big. Now in Sofia, where I've actually been to several times, there's about 3,000 to 4,000 Jews. But it was clearly a centre of Jewish life before the war. I'm very interested in how we teach about Chevra Kadisha, how we talk about it. Rabbi Rowley before said, one of the gentlemen in your community was very quiet about it. It's not something that is acknowledged very much, and there's a tension because I feel we need to let people know about it. It's a part of Jewish life. We need to do it in a respectful way. We also need to recruit new members. But if you don't know what it's about, and if it's in this sort of secrecy and fear, and it's a very difficult thing to do. So someone I know in the Netherlands wrote a children's book about grandpa dying. And there are many books, to help kids understand death. But what she did, which I believe is unique, and if anybody knows of another book, I'd be very interested to hear about it, is she talked about the Chevra Kadisha and the Tahara. And if you look at the top line, there are pictures of the Tachrichim, basically saying, grandpa will be dressed in these Tachrichim before he's buried, and just very gently introducing this idea of death and Tachrichim and the Jewish rituals that take place. And this is and this is contemporary. She did this about 10, 15 years ago. And I think it would be good to translate it. And also you see the meal, the egg and the bread sort of towards the bottom of the page. So really introducing Jewish rituals in a very gentle way, not comic, sort of in a graphic novel, graphic book. But what particularly piqued my interest was the Tachrichim being shown there, because that really, most people have no idea about it until they get involved in this field. Okay, so things have been very difficult the last few years, and two events. First, Corona. We thought, how are we going to get through this? And I'd be very interested to hear what happened in your community. In London, there was no Tahara. Basically what happened, we were told, first of all, people over the age of 65, anyone with compromised health, there were a whole lot of people who couldn't do Tahara. When we did it, we didn't look like that, but you had to put on a lot of protective gear. The Tachrichim were just placed on top of the body, and there was no washing, no ritual, no basic cleaning, and no ritual washing. And the Tachrichim were just put on top of the body in the casket. Casket was closed, and the person was buried. Is that what happened here? No, don't remember anymore. And then you did the whole thing, like. Right. Right, starting March 20 was COVID. And my point is, I just wanted to sort of bring, so this was in Israel, and I'm sure you've seen many of these images, but it seems like a lifetime away, in Holon, And there was a special morgue. There was a whole, it's one thing in a small community. It's another thing when the whole country has to deal with this and what was done. And so I think it's important to reflect back on, what happened, but also what was the loss. And so there's another photo here of a funeral happening. So not only did we lose the ability, we lost the ability to give the person that respect that so many others had. So it's another sort of grieving in a way. So the family, even if they don't know exactly what happens during a tahara, they know that usually the deceased is handled and respectfully given, dressed in the right sort of clothes or whatever it might be. Here, nothing happened, and that's another level, another loss for the family who's already bereaved. Now, I wanted to share a couple of images, and I spoke to, I think Sandy mentioned it when I had coffee in the other room. There's an Israeli artist, Ukrainian originally, named Zoya Cherkasy, and she's done some fantastic some very haunting pictures about the current situation. But during COVID, she did some paintings reflecting the COVID situation. And I thought this was just a very evocative painting. And clearly this is in Israel, because the big difference in Israel is that people are not buried in a casket. In general, they're buried directly into the ground. The only difference are soldiers who are buried in caskets, because there may well be body parts missing or severely damaged bodies, and they're put into a casket. And the other painting that she did related to COVID, I really like this. This may or may not have been at a cemetery for Kaddish, but whatever, it's this sort of idea of the separation that we all experience during our davening. In terms of the Zoom Kaddish and the Zoom funerals, they obviously, I'm sure they happened here, they were a big thing in England. And during, I can't remember exactly when now, but during COVID, Chief Rabbi Sachs died, Jonathan Sachs. And you can imagine that would have been a huge funeral. And it was a very small funeral. I think 20 people were allowed. The family, 3 children and in-laws, children-in-law, and a few rabbis were there, a few communal leaders. It was Zoomed, and I'm sure thousands of people watched it. But it was a real, in a way, it was like, well, if this is what Jonathan Sachs has to endure and his family, then it's for everybody. There was this real sense, but there was also a tremendous sense of loss in the Anglo-Jewish community, the sort of centrist Orthodox community, because they weren't able to show him that last respect of coming to the funeral. It would have been thousands of people there. There was something very poignant about him dying without having that crowd of people around him. And I reflected on this a little bit in the book, what I've just said, that the pandemic will be defined by how we lived online and remembered for how we mourned online. Death in the time of Corona has catapulted mortality into the public arena. Now in England, the British don't talk about stuff. I'm from Australia, we're very direct. I've lived in England for a long time now, and I still don't know exactly the codes of when you say things. You can say things, you can't say things. What's fantastic about Americans, they're very direct. Say it as it is. So the talking about death perhaps is not as foreign here as it is in Britain. It's very hush-hush, and I personally think that needs to change. What Corona did, certainly within the Jewish community, was it did change that, because people were so distressed by not being able to go to funerals. And even though they might not have known what a Chevra Kadisha does, it opened up the fact that there is a Chevra, and what were the Chevra doing? It became much more public. And there was a tension between the Chevra not wanting to be so out there and so public, with the fact that they won the Volunteer of the Year award from the Jewish newspaper during Corona. And they were sort of a bit embarrassed, the heads of the Chevra were a little bit embarrassed, but at the same time it was a great recognition of their work. And when I wanted to write the short book that I've written, what originally started was I wanted to write a book about the women in the Chevra. I thought it'd be really interesting what motivated them, why they're doing it, what is their own history with death. And I asked the woman who's in charge of the chevra, I said, would you send out an email sort of giving it a bit of a hechsher, saying this would be okay to answer Sally's questions? Anyway, short of slamming the phone down on me, she said, absolutely not. It's totally inappropriate. We don't do this. You don't talk about it. I couldn't support anything like that. I thought, okay, fine, I understand. So I went and did my own thing, which was not what I originally had planned to do. And what's been very comforting for me is I've had a very warm and positive reaction because people have said we didn't know about all of this stuff. How are we meant to know about it if we don't talk about it? And what I've tried to do is give a respectful overview, but also raise a lot of issues. And I talk about, which is not what's here, but in the book is more about my own journey with grief and mourning and loss in my own family and reflecting on that as a member of the Chevra Kadisha, but also then touching on Corona. And what I found about Corona and what I think is the most relevant is that people felt bereft with no send-off, no last family embrace, no chance for the last word, and no friend to hold their hand. Pending regulations at various times, some people were buried alone with only their grave diggers for company. Thus, a bereft family pain was amplified. Because there were times in England where literally, four people, I think, 5 people could go to a funeral. So it really was just the grave diggers and perhaps one other. Now, people move on and hopefully I don't want to say gets over it, but it's when they reflect back on having buried someone close to them and that's their memory, that's a difficult thing. So we talked about Corona. Now we're going through a different sort of difficult time, and I felt I had to tweak this presentation given what's going on in Israel. There was a fascinating article in the Times of Israel by interviewing this Rabbi Ruzin talking about the implications of the deaths from the music festival, from the soldiers that were killed in the first couple of days, and subsequent events. Very, very powerful, very moving. And one of the issues he talked about is what do we do with all the cars that were destroyed? Because a lot of those cars have human blood on them. And as you all know, we bury every little bit that we can of somebody. So at some point somebody wanted to, I think it came about because people wanted to sell the cars as scrap metal, and the Chevra Kadisha intervened and said, you can't do that. There's blood on these cars. This belongs to people. And you couldn't wash the cars. So there's a discussion about, do we bury all these cars? Do we create a memorial? I think they're still trying to work out what to do. I don't know if a final decision has been made. But I didn't even think about such a thing, to be honest. You just don't. And then when you start reading and you start thinking about it, you think, oh my goodness, it's really very, very powerful. And the I'm not going to talk politics and I want to talk about, the events, but the events raises so many issues for the Chevra Kadisha's work that were unimaginable, also raised the profile of the Chevra Kadisha in Israel. I don't know how many of you go to Israel often or have friends, family there. And here, certainly in England, the work of the Chevra is all voluntary. In Israel, it's state-run employees. There are a few exceptions where there's a voluntary Chevra, but essentially it's run by the Rabbanut and they're state employees. So it's a different, and people have ambivalences and tensions, and sometimes they feel, particularly families who are not particularly religious, feel not quite understood by the Chevra. So there are issues, but in the last couple of months, because of what's happened, there's been a much greater understanding and appreciation for sort of the work that they're doing. I wanted to speak very briefly about a woman named Sherry Mendez. She's had quite a bit of PR, the issues have had quite a bit of PR lately. She spoke on a podcast recently that it was riveting and poignant and everything. Have people heard about her work? So she's on the Chevra of the IDF, but she's also been speaking out about the rapes and the sexual mutilation very powerfully. And until recently, there were not that many women. There have always been women soldiers, but not that many in combat. So there were occasional deaths of women soldiers, and they were dealt with by small group of women through the army. More recently, there are many more women soldiers, and specifically now we all know what happened on October 7th with the young soldiers who were out looking out from their posts. So this is a training, snip from a training program for the soldiers. So you can see the woman lying down is in uniform, and they're going through, they're training women how to deal with the bodies. And Shari that I've given the link, and I'm happy to send it if anybody wants, to the community, the link of her podcast, which is extremely powerful. And she talks here at the end, we look for any personal effects of jewellery that may not have been noticed during the medical examination. They are precious treasures that we can give back to the family. We prepare the aron that will carry each one to the next station on her journey. The smell of freshly sawed wood will never be the same for me. We lift and gently place each one in her aron and ask for mechila, to ask for forgiveness. And there's something so, I'm struggling for the words for it, to participate in the Chevra Kadisha over the last 4 months, I would imagine would be a life-changing experience for many of the people involved. So it's, heavy, tough stuff. I wanted to begin to leave you with something a little more, shall we say, cheery and open up for wider discussion. Shalom Aleichem was buried in New York, 1916. Have a guess how many people turned up to his funeral? Sorry? 100,000. The New York Times said 100,000 people turned up. So that's pretty good. They won't be coming for that. There won't be that many for me, I can tell you that. And he wrote an ethical will, or a will, I guess, would you call it ethical? And it was published in the New York Times, which I just think is so interesting, other than just, quite a hoot. And what I wanted to do was highlight a couple of lines. So he says he'd like his son and his son-in-law, if they're so minded, so, he's not pushing them, to say Kaddish for him. And so he's saying, I think he's saying, I'd really like this to happen, but it's your choice. No pressure. This is what I'd really like to happen for me. But at the same time, what he would also like, if they don't want to say Kaddish, he wants the family to get together, select one of my stories, one of the really joyous ones, and read it aloud. So he wants to be remembered by his wonderful stories. And this got me thinking a lot about legacy. How do we remember other people? I've heard this evening about beloved members of your community, and clearly you're remembering them by telling the stories about them. And many people have stories that they've written or stories about them that everybody knows. But and this is another thing I think about when you're doing the chevra, there's a woman in front of you, you know nothing about her. Where I do it, and it might be different in your own community, you may know the person who's died, and that will happen in small community chevras. In London, it's through the United Synagogue, and whoever's there, in fact, most people would choose not to do somebody that they know. So there's a woman in front of you, whatever age, you think, who was she? What did she do? What's her family? We basically only know her name and how old she was, and if there's some cause of death that we know, we're told. But otherwise, it's just a woman that you're doing something for. And I've thought a lot about this. What is it that you want to leave behind? Not just the physical things you leave behind. You can pass on a ring, a piece of jewelry, but what are the life lessons you want to leave? And I think he was leaving this life lesson of his stories. He wanted to be remembered by his stories. And on the other part, he had a son who predeceased him, who's buried in Copenhagen. And this is the son. He definitely wanted somebody to say Kaddish for his son. And they should do that and pay somebody to do it if nobody's around in Copenhagen. And on his yahrzeit every year, Kaddish should be said and be given money to poor people. So he clearly was a very traditional, observant person, or believed in the observance and wanted that carried out after his death. And this led me to think a lot about different rituals. When there's the funeral, there's the shiva, there's the shloshim, the kaddish, the yahrzeit, pretty programmed, for many, many years, set of rituals. And I think they're terrific. I think it's very sensible, very helpful. I've been through it many times, unfortunately, myself. And I have no qualms with it. But a lot of people do. They don't like it, they feel it's invasive, whatever reason it might be. Is there another way to do things? And what could they be? And in Israel, there's sort of talk of an Israeli Judaism, Jewish practices that evolved that are very typically Israeli. And I'm thinking Friday night on the beach in Tel Aviv, with singing, with musical instruments, with engaging people. It may not be the Shabbat of a more observant family, but it's acknowledging that the day is different and using the tools and engaging people in ways that speak to them. When we know Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Day, there are big ceremonies and lighting candles, and it's all it's a big thing. Certainly where I grew up, Yom HaShoah was a bigger deal than Yom Kippur. If you didn't turn up for Yom HaShoah, you're really in trouble. Across generations, that was the defining Chag, I'd say, almost, for the Jewish community in Melbourne. But what's evolved in Israel, and now in England as well, maybe here, is Zicharon Basalon, where you bring people together to share memories of a survivor, somebody in your family, and you make it a much more intimate setting. I'm not saying that this is a religious act or sort of halachic process that's gone on, but it's acknowledging that we need a different way to do things. So I'm interested in are there ways, if Kaddish doesn't speak to somebody, if they don't want to sit Shiva, if they don't want to have the Shloshim, are there other ways that draw on our tradition that can be adapted, that make sense for people, and help people have an ownership of an important life stage that they're going through? So I'm going to draw to a close shortly, so perhaps when we open it up for conversation, I'd be very interested to hear that. So I wanted to share with you, because I just think it's a wonderful will. If you're going to if you want to be remembered, to sort of draw on your strengths and draw on what you've already done to share that with people. And what I'm sharing here, at the end of my book, I've treated it as a bit of a recap of everything that's discussed in the book, and under the headings of the chapters, with questions to ask oneself. And you can use it in a book group, you can use it just with your family, because it's so difficult to break down the barriers of talking about death in families. It's just a hard topic. And this may be a helpful tool to ask the sort of questions that you want to discuss with your children, with your partner, with the wider community that you're in. And when I'll just give a couple of them. Even joining the February, if you wanted to recruit more people, what are the questions you might tap into to ask people to join a Chevra, to see if they're interested in it? I didn't focus on Kaddish, but I just want to spend a moment talking about that, because that's had certainly in the Orthodox community, there's been tremendous change. I did write a different book looking at Orthodox women and changes that have happened. And one of the biggest changes is women saying Kaddish. Nowadays that sounds all rather passé, but 20, 30 years ago, certainly in England, many women in the Orthodox community who were told you can't come to a funeral, which is a very English thing, you can't come to a funeral and you certainly can't say Kaddish. That was the moment at which they said, I'm out of here, forget it. If Orthodoxy can't help me grieve, what's the point? And they went to other movements. What's happened in the last, even in England, which is the most small c conservative, the Orthodox community have encouraged and welcomed women in saying Kaddish. Now, you could be a cynic and say that's because they don't want them to go to other movements, or you could say actually they've recognised that it's an important part of grieving that men do, and that women should be doing it, should have the opportunity and be encouraged to do it as well. And I think that we've seen a real sea change in that process. No. They're not correct, yeah. So you need, no, absolutely. You need 10 men, but the women can say Kaddish. And in some Orthodox communities, they'll let the woman say Kaddish without the men saying it. In some Orthodox communities, even if a man, they want a man to say it along with them. So it'll vary on the community. That's a very valid question. I'm trying to think around COVID. Right, I wanted to talk a little bit about digital death and the life after death. There's a few elements to that. One is just administratively. You should know the passwords to every important computer in your house and the phone because when somebody dies and you don't know their password, it's a real pain. Some of you may have already experienced that. And so there's an element of administratively thinking and planning for death. That's nothing Jewish, that's just neurotic. You just got to sort of make sure all your passwords, that you know the passwords. Another element is what you curate about your life, your Facebook, all your social media. There's a lot of talk about it. But what are you curating around your Jewish life? How do you want to be remembered online? What images are you keeping on, taking off? And it's a sort of, I should pause and let you know a bit of biography. Unfortunately, everyone in my family died suddenly, literally dropped dead. It's just my mother, my father, and my younger brother. So it was very difficult, and I don't mean to sound flippant about it. So I've had a lot of experience of very sudden death. Many other people have an experience of over a long period of time, very painful. There's no right or wrong, no better or worse. It's just different. So I'm very conscious that things can change literally from 1 minute to the next. And people say, I'll see you next week. And I'm thinking, well, I might see you next week. I might not see you next week. And I'm very bad at making long-term plans, booking flights months in advance. Very bad at that, which means I end up paying a fortune for flights. Because I have this, it's my own thing. You just don't know what's going to be. And so I'm a little obsessive about, the passwords, but how your Facebook looks like, whatever social media you have, to be conscious of that's what you're leaving behind, or you're leaving instructions for somebody to take it down. But the other part of the digital death that I'm interested in is the whole AI and how, what's going to be on our graves and holograms of Holocaust survivors. It is quite, doesn't have to be of Holocaust survivors. One of the big tools around Holocaust education has been creating, you know what holograms are? Sort of these 3D. And so that's a sort of digital death in a way, because they're being created while the person's still alive, obviously drawing questions and answers. But after they're gone, that's what will be left. They'll be at a particular time in their life, particular age, and that's how they'll be remembered. And I wonder, should we all have a hologram? Maybe, the whole avatar and metaverse, and maybe that's a part of it. But should we be creating holograms for our great-great-grandchildren to come? I don't have the answer to that, but it's interesting. You see on grave sites I mentioned Sofia and in other countries in Eastern Europe, at the cemetery you'll have the tombstone, and there are often photos of the people on the tombstone. When I first saw that, I thought it was, a couple of people are nodding, maybe you've seen that as well. I found it a bit, it wasn't what I was used to. But then I thought, okay, that does mean when relatives in the future come and find their great-great-grandmother, that they'll see a photo of them. Or should we have a digital photo there? Should we have, these photo frames that change every 10 seconds? Should we have that? I mean, it sounds sort of very tacky, but how do we begin to remember people? Or do we just keep it very simple? I have a friend whose father died. He was a serious book collector. All it had on his tombstone was his name and Ish Sefer, a man of books. That was it. And on the one hand, I thought that's beautiful because that summed him up. And on the other hand, I thought, well, I know who his kids are and his family, but nobody else will. Does that matter? I don't know. But it's different families choose to do different things. So I'm very interested in how we remember others and how we choose to be remembered. So I wanted to highlight that element of what I call the digital death. So I really wanted to give you a sense, and with this I'll leave you and open up to questions, comments, give you a sense of a real range of different issues related to Chevra Kadisha, the history of it. There are so many more images and visual culture around Chevra, but I wanted to give you a flavour. You can look these things up yourself. The actual process, I didn't go into huge detail with because it seems all of you know that. And then just thinking, what is it that we leave behind? And I think Zayin Adar, when we think about and appreciate the work of the Chevra, we should take a moment to think about our own mortality and our own contributions to the world, and it's an appropriate day to do that. So I wanted to really thank my friend Seth for facilitating this introduction to the community, thank Rabbi Rowley, thank Billy for all the admin around it and for today, and leave you with these questions and perhaps open up for conversation. Be very interested in what you do, how things operate here, and thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
If anybody has questions, this is again for the people on the. This microphone is for the people on the live stream. If anybody has questions.
Some of us were talking about this earlier. Have you encountered any community whose Chevra Kadisha has provided for a transgender person?
I haven't myself. I know it's a discussion that's going on at the moment. I've seen a response by Dov Linzer on this issue. I've read, I have to say, I don't know. I think the Reform community is dealing with that much better and addressing it. I'm not aware that the Orthodox community, certainly in England, have had to work with somebody who's transgender. From what I understand, and maybe others of you have had that, let's say somebody is born male, identifies as a woman, and lives as a woman. At the time of doing the tahara, she will be treated by the women of the Chevra Kadisha with her genitals, male genitals, covered. How they deal with that, I suppose it's probably different if someone's had surgery. I don't know enough about it, but it has certainly been addressed in some of the literature. And there's an organisation, maybe it'll come to me, that is actually, is it Keshet? Maybe it's called Keshet. There is an organisation supporting LGBTQ people in the community who are addressing that specifically. That's all I know.
Sorry, this is not a question. Some of us were on the Israel trip, and this issue of what has happened since October the 7th. So I want to just make 2 points. One was, I don't think it's the person you were alluding to, but it was a woman who was on the Tahara teams those 10 days, 2 weeks immediately following. Now you can imagine, we're doing one a month maybe, they were doing 10 a day. So you can imagine, just think about it and think what they were confronting. We don't do it when it's a very violent death. So that, Tony Siegel sent me the video. I can share it. I chose not to because it was so hard to watch. But if you're interested, it probably is worth watching. The other is that we had a presentation by a woman lawyer who is, stand up? No. We had a presentation by a woman lawyer who is tasked with providing evidence to the UN of what actually happened. Now, as you can imagine, because they were burying so fast, there was no forensic evidence. So the only testimony is eyewitnesses. So it was the Zakar guys, and it was the people doing Tahara. So I found it shattering that there was no forensic evidence.
I just wanted to acknowledge that Miriam was the one that created our Chevra Kadisha many years ago. Thank you, Miriam.
I just wanted to reflect on from what I understand happens here is that every community has its own chevra, which means you are doing the taharas for people you know. Whereas in London, it's much more it is centralised. So the mainstream United Synagogue, which is the mainstream, I don't know what the equivalent here is, would, it's all the shuls are in at the same time. You're on a rota. I do Sundays because I work during the week. And as I said, we don't know who we're doing. And I like that because I like they don't know who I am, obviously, but I don't know who they, it's just a complete anonymity. But having now spoken to a few people here, I can see it would be a different experience if you know the person. We're obviously very respectful, very tender with the body, but I would imagine if you know them, it would be very different. Do you want to?
Well, on the west side, each shul has its own. This year, on the east side, there has been a Reform Hever Kadisha formed, which is among a number of Reform synagogues.
Right. Interesting.
First year
Right.
now. They've not had them before.
So they didn't have tahara before. Nope. Interesting. One of the sensitive issues around cremation, and the question is, can you do a tahara if you know somebody's going to be cremated? And I only heard about that fairly recently, which I thought was an interesting point. You know, and some people probably wouldn't want to because, well, if someone's choosing to be cremated, we're not going to give them a tahara. Or the other approach is, let's do that at least, and then people choose to do what they want to do. And I just, on the point of, just one moment, on the point of cremation, it's very evocative in Eastern Europe. Because, and in Prague, nowadays in Prague, I actually was on a call about something completely not related to this. But it emerged that in the cemetery there, they've got issues because many people are intermarried, so can both the Jewish person and the non-Jewish person be buried in the same graveyard? But then they have a plot for the remains of the cremated bodies, and they put them in a jar and they're buried. And the rationale and why many people in the Prague Jewish community get cremated, just hold your breath, is it was good enough for my grandparents. That's what I want to happen for me as well. Now, at first I thought, I was like, oh my God. But actually, if you think about it, it's not about whether it's right, it's wrong. It's just that was their way of identifying with their family's history. The same way you see some young people who have tattooed the number of their relative from the camps, they've tattooed that on their forearms as well. It doesn't, it's not a matter of whether one agrees or disagrees. It's something that I'm not particularly comfortable with, but if that person, that's the way that they identify with their family experience. So I just wanted to note that because I found it quite a shocking thing when I first heard it, but I've been thinking about it quite a bit. You wanted to say?
So I just want to say on the issue of tahara, cremation, our rabbis definitely don't encourage it. But in the event that someone does want to be cremated, if we know in advance, we will try and let the tahara members know so they can choose to opt out. But we have certainly done tahara knowing that there would be cremation.
There's a lady at the back.
So I'm going to ask Sharon to help me with this because we have done virtual taharot.
Oh, what does that look like?
Where we couldn't actually do tahara, but we've gotten together.
So what does that mean? What does that look like? I've not heard of it.
It was more of like having the kavanah and not... Sharon, do you want to talk more about that? Do you remember? Do you remember what we did? Because my we did for Adar. Yeah.
So this was a situation where somebody's husband died who was not Jewish. And at the time, we were exploring what red lines we had in this community. And I knew for myself, like tahara, how could you conceive of doing tahara for a non-Jew? That was one of my red lines. But this gentleman died, it was before COVID, 2019. And we happened to be at Plaza for some meeting.
That's our funeral home.
Right. And we all wanted to do tahara because it just felt like the right thing to do. So we called the widow and said, will this be okay? And she, of course, said yes. And we did a virtual tahara. We did not have the met, but we, as Rochelle says, the kavanah was there that we wanted to honor him. So it was sort of, we were more flexible than we thought we would be.
Right. So out of curiosity, where are the burial grounds? Because in London, you do the tahara at the burial ground. It's not at a funeral home. So where are the burial grounds? Here. Oh, okay. Right. So they're buried wherever. Oh, I see. Okay, it's much more centralised in England.
So, you know, the thing about certain questions and answers in the Chavod Kadisha's traditions change from one place to another, but it's the same aspect of the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. And the house of Shammai says the question of Shabbat, lighting the candles, that it's not negotiable. You light the candles when you have to light the candles at 4:30, 4:35, 2, 7, 6. Hillel says, better a little Shabbos than none. When you come home from something late and you light the candles, you bring Shabbos into the home. So no one is penalized, but you have to use your seichel a little bit. And the thing is, what feels right, not what feels good, but what feels right. And what feels right is, for me, is better a little Shabbos than none.
Thank you for sharing that thought.
I just wanted to supplement something you said about certain, especially in Sephardic communities, where they'll wear a kittel at the wedding and that they'll be buried in. I believe in many of those communities, they also wear the kittel every year at the Seder.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
And so it's sort of, it must have a sobering effect, but it sort of creates a normalization, acceptance of death. I mean, your tachrichim are with you every year, all through.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I wonder. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
I don't know if I wanted to share this or not, but I will. But in Auschwitz, the people that did have to put the bodies in the oven did say their prayers for the people that they were doing that for. So there was like a personal ritual that was created by the men that had that unfortunate role in life during that period of time. So it's not like they did not say their prayers for the people that had died.
There are any more? I mean, I've got other things I can. Billy, what time did you want to wind up?
Now is good if
Now is
we're
good?
if
Oh,
we're
no,
good. You let me know.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to thank Sally so much for being with us. This was really a beautiful evening. Thank you, everybody here and everybody. I have no idea where the camera is, but everybody watching on the live stream. I just wanted to say, if you are not a volunteer with the Chavra Kadisha and you're here tonight and you're a BJ member, please consider joining us. Reach out to me. You can find me all over the website, and I will get you some information. If you are a volunteer with the Chavra Kadisha and you haven't raised your hand of an email that you've seen recently, please consider raising your hand and joining us. We have a lot of people who don't come forward, and that's okay. You're still one of us, but please consider raising your hand next time you see one of those emails. Those requests come in, and if you're not a BJ member and you're watching on the live stream or you're here tonight, please consider stopping by, checking us out, and joining us, and maybe volunteering one day and becoming part of our beautiful community. And so Sally's going to be selling her book, the Death. What's that?
Okay, we need to sort out the logistics.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
But we will be doing that, and I think she'll probably sign them too, is my guess. And I don't know if you want to say anything else before we close.
No, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to the community, and Patzlacha with all your work.
Thank you.